In the early 1990s, one man held an entire country hostage. He blew up a commercial airliner, he ordered the assassination of a presidential candidate, he bribed judges, politicians, generals, and whenever he couldn't get his way out with bribery and resources, he murdered them. That man's name was Pablo Escobar, and at the height of his power, he was not only the most wanted man on earth, but the most dangerous man on earth. This is the story of how Colombia, with help from the United States, were finally able to bring down his drug empire. Welcome to my school podcast. Today, we're diving deep into Killing Pablo by Mark Bowden, and I'm your host, Caleb Altuzar. To understand the hunt, you have to understand the man. What I mean by this, Mark Bowden opens Killing Pablo not with a shootout or a case, but with a portrait. Pablo Escobar grew up in Envigado, a suburb of Medellin, and from childhood showed a singular obsession with getting rich. We see this in the first chapter, The Pawn, when Bowden describes how Escobar began as a petty theft, stealing gravestones and reselling them. He notes that Pablo was driven less by the ideology and more on pure desires like wealth, status, wanting more for your family. By his 30s, Escobar had built the Medellin cartel into a cocaine empire. At its peak, it supplied roughly 80% of the cocaine entering the United States. He was entering an estimated $420 million a week, but Bowden is careful here. This isn't a glamoration. Alongside the wealth, Escobar ordered thousands of murders, police officers, judges, journalists, politicians. He called his campaign Tierra, Plata o Plomo, silver or lead, take the bribe or take the bullet, portraying the image of him being ruthless to people that choose to be against him rather than alongside him. We see this in the second chapter of the book, where Bowden writes that Escobar saw violence not as a last resort, but as a primary tool, efficient, clarifying, and cheap compared to the cost of corruption. By 1992, the Colombian government had had enough. After Escobar briefly and almost comically surrendered and checked himself into a luxury prison he essentially designed for himself, called La Catedral. He simply walked out when authorities had tried to transfer him. The embarrassment was total. We see this in Chapter 4, where Bowden's account of Escobar's self-built prison is extraordinary. He describes how Pablo had a soccer field, a bar, a jacuzzi, and received visits from family and business associates. While technically serving a sentence, Colombian officials who visited were reportedly stunned. One source told Bowden it was more like a country club than a prison. After the escape, President Cesar Gaviria authorized the creation of a special police unit, the Bloque de Pescada, search block, headquartered in Medellin and tasked with one mission: find Pablo. Leading the search block was Colonel Hugo Martinez. Bowden spent considerable time on Martinez, a straight-laced, persistent, deeply Catholic cop who would become Escobar's primary pursuer. This wasn't glamorous work. The search block was underfunded, outgunned, and operating in a city where Escobar had thousands of informants and loyalists, and they were being killed for it. Bowden's documents wave after wave of Escobar's retaliatory attacks, car bombs, assassinations of officers, family members, and a bounty of $2,000 placed on the head of any Medellin cop. This put fright and terror into the community of Colombia, making the city seem so corrupt, not even cops are allowed to do their jobs. This is shown in Chapter 5, where Bowden writes that Martinez understood he was asking his men to walk into a war zone every day, for modest government pay against an enemy who could afford to pay for more than their deaths, more than Colombia would pay. The 7 chapters when the book starts to get controversial, and where Bowden does most of his important journalism. The United States had numerous stakes in taking down Pablo Escobar. The cocaine flooding American cities was all Pablo's product. So quietly, the U.S. sent help, and this is where Killing Pablo stops being just a crime story, becomes something more uncomfortable. The NSA began intercepting Escobar's phone calls. The CIA had assets on the ground and a unit of U.S. Army Delta Force operators. Officially present only as trainers, were deeply embedded with the search block, helping analyze intelligence. Bowden suggests potentially doing considerably more. This is seen as again in the 7th chapter, where Bowden details the classified U.S. signals as Centrospike, whose aircraft flew over Medellin triangulating Escobar's phone signals. He notes that the U.S. government officially denied any combat role, but that the lines between advising and participating became increasingly blurred. But there was a darker element, Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This was a vigilante death squad made up of Escobar's enemies, rival cartel members, including the Cali cartel and former associates Pablo had betrayed. They began systematically murdering Escobar's lawyers, family members, and allies. Bowden raises the question directly: did the search block, and by extension, American intelligence, share information with Los Pepes? With the evidence he presents, like in Chapter 9, between the search block and Los Pepes, in 1993, they were able to predict the whereabouts of Pablo Escobar's lawyer and take his life. By late 1993, Escobar was a man in collapse. His network had been dismantled, his money was harder to move. His family, his wife, and children refused asylum by every country they approached. And crucially, he couldn't stop calling them. That's what did it, the phone calls. Escobar called his son Juan Pablo almost daily, and each call the Centrospike aircraft and Colonel Martinez's son, who had joined the search block with his own equipment, were getting closer to a fix. Because in the moments Pablo think they weren't listening, they were. By triangulating his calls, they have been able to counterattack him and find his whereabouts. All because he lets his guard down due to his family, the people he wanted to make proud. We see this in the Last Days chapter, where Bowden describes a psychological portrait of Escobar in hiding as almost pitiable. A man who have commanded armies, now alone, overweight, and uncontempt, moving between safe house and safe house, calling his teenage son to give him advice and declare his love. He was still Pablo, but Pablo diminished. On 1993, they were able to triangulate and intercept a call to his house in Los Olvios, neighborhood in Medellin. The search block moved in. There was a firefight. Escobar tried to flee across rooftops. He was shot 3 times. The fatal bullet entered his right ear. Whether it was fired by search block police or was self-inflicted remains disputed to this day. In the epilogue, it addresses the mystery of who shot directly, noting that Colonel Martinez's son, who was present, believed Pablo may have shot himself rather than be taken alive. Bowden declines to render a verdict, writing, "In truth, of the last bullet may never be known." The most significant and behavioral indicator with Pablo Escobar was his compulsive need to maintain personal communication with his family. Despite being the most hunted man in Colombia, he refused to abandon phone contact with his wife and son. The attachment, the emotional dependency, the need and ambition he had for control over his family. This created the most exploitable vulnerability. Referencing back to Chapter 11, Bowden documents that Escobar called his son Juan Pablo almost daily. Even as his networks collapsed, the calls were always prolonged, emotional, operationally careless. He would always mention how much he loved them and how everything he did was for them, but he never asked for forgiveness. By monitoring these calls, each conversation narrowed the geographic window. Behaviorally, this reflects what forensic psychologists term leakage, the involuntary communication of intent or location through behavior the offender cannot suppress. Escobar's use of mass violence, car bombings, assassinations, and taking down flights, they were able to properly predict. This makes him responsible for killing over 50 people, with a consistent documented pattern of targeting state institutions. We see this in Chapter 3, where Bowden notes the escalation of terror against the Colombian state. This was directly correlated with the government's attempts to try to extradite him to the U.S. The violence was not random. It was strategically calibrated to each perceived threat. Despite vast resources and the ability to relocate internationally, Escobar remained anchored to Medellin and its surrounding barrios, particularly the neighborhood where his loyalist network, the Sicaros, operated. This geographic loyalty was both a strength and a forensic indicator. Investigators concentrated resources in Medellin, because they understood from behavioral analysis that Escobar's identity and power base were inseparable from the city. The main technology used in this case was CentraSpike's Airborne Sight, an analog cell phone triangulation system that was ground-based, direction finding, and was operated by Martinez's son. And today we would use IMSI catchers, satellite-linked intercept systems that are AI assisted and pattern recognized. Back then, the calls were not able to be traced if they were for short, brief amounts of time. If you're able to get a call with prolonged amounts of time, the accuracy within the block range would increase. Now, GPS accurate AI can identify devices from seconds of transmission. In an instant, they can go from cell tower to cell tower. And back then, it would have to take hours or days to even intercept the call, meaning some of Escobar's raids were delayed due to processing. Now, as I said, they're instantaneous, and they go from cell tower to data center very easily, very quickly. Back then, it was also a lot more expensive because you had to secure aircrafts which can range to multi-millions of dollars. You would also have to deploy large NSA teams internationally. Nowadays, these devices would range from $300,000 to $400,000. Due to all the new modern technology that we have, if this case were to take place now, it would probably be around 90% shorter due to the amount of equipment and modern technology we have today. And it would have never even got to this point to be as big as